Hello, AP historians, and glad to be with you here as we begin Unit 3 of our journey through European history. We have now moved on to the second time period that we cover, which is 1648 to 1815. 1648, of course, being the year of the Peace of Westphalia, which is kind of a marker, an end of the wars of religion, and in many ways the beginning of this period that we call the Age of Absolutism. Where there's going to be a lot of transition, a lot of change in the way that European states are both governing themselves as well as relationships between them. They're going to become much more complicated. We're going to see kind of a further sophistication and change in economics, and that's going to begin to foster societal change as well as we move into the 18th and then, of course, into the 19th century. 1815 being the year this section ends, which is the fall of Napoleon, ending the age of the French Revolution. But, of course, that's a discussion for another day. So beginning Unit 3, as you can see, we're going to kind of look at a wide range of political styles. This is kind of the backdrop for this whole section. If you get a few moments to look at your AMSCO book, you'll see that Unit 3 covers several topics, absolutism and constitutionalism being large ones, but looking specifically at changes in England, the Dutch Golden Age, which we'll talk about, as well as a lot about economic and social change as well. But we're going to begin kind of looking at the political map, and then if we can understand the political changes that take place throughout the 17th century, it really kind of helps us provide a framework for everything else. So this video lecture is going to cover kind of these big ideas, and of course, it being recorded, I'll give you the opportunity to go back and view it several times. Anything you miss, you can slow it down, rewind it, and all those types of things. Of course, we don't have a ton of time to miss classes because of the fact that we were already missing days due to us being an elective. So I figured this would be a good way to kind of make up some time by showing you these videos. And so this is a little bit of a lengthy introduction to this, and anyone's after this, so we'll just jump right into it. All right, but this picture you see here is a picture of a young King Louis XIV being visited by courtiers. We'll kind of talk about the significance of images like this as we go along. But as we begin, I want to look at this as we say, providing context. So the last time we had a political discussion was the formation of new monarchies, and that's kind of what that first point that you see on the screen says. They're national monarchies consolidated during the Renaissance period, the 15th and 16th centuries. And remember, what that means is that we're moving away from kind of regional kingdoms that are built around old feudal boundaries, and we're beginning to see the creation of national monarchies, where areas where people have a unique and specific culture and language are now being ruled directly from a capital city by one particular monarch. And so remember, these national monarchies that we have identified were the Kingdom of Spain, which was unified by Ferdinand and Isabella, the Kingdom of England under the Tudor dynasty in Henry VII, and then the Kingdom of France, which finally, after several hundred years of slow growth, the King of France finally controlled a large portion of the French-speaking territories under his domain, was able to create a national army and things like that, which only increased his power. So that was the kind of the new monarchies that we talked about previously, and it's going to be a trend that we're going to see continue. Look down to the third point. It says, wealth from exploration and expanding trade will give rulers larger treasuries to run their kingdom and to support a national military. right? Kings need a military, right? They need military power to enforce their will, right? A military is, in essence, a political tool, right? Rulers will always have political desires, and having an army is a way to see those desires fulfilled, either to defend a realm or to expand it. All right, remember, for example, in our previous section, right, the Spanish under Philip II wanted to punish the English, specifically Elizabeth, for her failure to remain Catholic and bring Protestantism permanently to England. And therefore they tried to use the might of the Spanish Navy, the Armada, to bring England to heel, and of course were unsuccessful in doing so. Right, so militarily, the English military protected the realm and therefore protected the interests of the crown, specifically of Elizabeth. So monarchies need militaries as a way of controlling not only their own territories, but, as we said, to kind of build political aims outside of those territories. And the wealth from the New World, right, which is only growing throughout the 15 and 1600s, is going to bring wealth and money back into the treasuries of these kingdoms so that they can pay for expensive things like weapons and soldiers and everything else, right? Philip II being probably the biggest proponent of this during his time as Spanish king, right, trying to use the wealth of the Spanish Empire in the New World to fight wars in the Netherlands and then, of course, bring the big navy into England. Both of those unsuccessful, but he had the means to do so because of the treasuries. And then we look at the second point. It says the nobles will present challenges to consolidating power. All right, so this is kind of the big idea, right, as we talk about context here, right? As we move into this whole section, the thing we need to understand is that nobility is a traditional center of power. And in the Middle Ages, nobles in many cases may have been more important to maintaining order within a territory than even the crown could do. And so nobles had privileged positions in the social structure of the kingdoms. They also had unique and high political positions as well. And those positions are now being challenged by kings as they are trying to strengthen their control, right? Anytime the king is going to strengthen his control over his domain, it is necessarily going to weaken the political power of the nobility, right? So kings really have two choices, as it says. They either can subdue the nobility into following their will, or they can incorporate them. They can cooperate with the nobility, make the nobles work with the crowns as a way of maintaining order. All right, and so we're going to kind of keep that idea in the back of our minds as we look at these different views of these absolutism as well as constitutionalism, which is a limit on kings' authorities. How do the nobles, how do traditional methods of power, traditional societal power bases, how do they fit into this changing model? All right, so as we begin, when you begin a discussion of 17th century absolutism, there's only one place you can begin, and that is in France. This is a video, which I'm not going to show you now, but I will link the video with these notes so you can go back and watch it. It's a very good overview of Louis's time in power. And so I encourage you to watch it and to kind of see the major issues. It covers his young life and how he came to power. It covers Versailles, which is a huge part of his the mystique that he builds as King of France. It talks about the revocation of the Edict of Nantes and the effect that had on the French kingdom. And then it talks about the end of his reign and the wars that he fought, specifically the War of Spanish Succession. So again, watch this little quick video when you get the chance. Maybe even pause this and watch that to kind of set up this time of Louis XIV. All right, so you can see Louis XIV becomes King of France in 1643. He was a young boy. He was about 4 years old when he became king. His father, Louis XIII, had died with Louis just still being a young child. But as you can see, because of his young age, when he becomes king, he will rule a long time until 1715 when he was in his 70s. And so Louis XIV has one of the longest reigns of any monarch, of course surpassed by Queen Elizabeth here in the 20th and 21st century. She, of course, the Queen Elizabeth II of England. So here is kind of the foundational position. So his father was Louis XIII, and you can see that he ruled for 33 years. Now, Louis XIII himself replaced Henry IV. Remember, I told you last week, Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of France, who converted to Catholicism, became king, and he was assassinated in the year 1610. So his son, Louis, was quite young, only 9 years old when he became king. And so it was important for him to have a regent, have somebody to kind of rule in his stead until he became of age. And it was his mother that did this, and his mother was very close to a guy named Armand Richelieu, who was a cardinal in the church, but he was also a trained diplomat and lawyer, and therefore a great would-be advisor to the crown. And so Richelieu, for all intents and purposes, was the true power behind the throne during the reign of Louis XIII. Louis, he did become of age, but he pretty much let Richelieu run the kingdom for him. And so Richelieu, in many ways, even though he himself was not king, he set up what we would call the foundations of absolutism, creating a strong national army in France, destroying several noble fortifications that have been set up around the country, which could potentially create a challenge to the authority of the crown. And he also created the first royal officials in France that would go around the provinces, the outskirts of the country, and work in the king's name, collecting taxes, building roads, making sure acting as judges, making sure the law was followed. They are called intendants. And so Louis XIII has Richelieu doing all of these things, and it was a big help because that means that for Louis XIV, when he becomes king, there's already kind of this establishment of a strong monarchy that is being put into place. Now, a second person that Louis XIV had that helped him was a guy named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He was the financial minister of France during Louis XIV's reign, and he was in many ways a financial wizard, using mercantilist policies, which means two things. Number one, it means that France was going to establish overseas colonies as a way of bringing money into the state, setting up colonies in the East, at least, and they began a long war with England over colonies in India. The French acquired some colonies in the Caribbean where they could grow sugar and things like that, and then they expanded their territory in New France, which is modern-day Canada, Quebec, and that region, setting up a very prosperous fur trade in the north of North America, bringing these very expensive pelts back to France where they could be turned into wealthy pieces of clothing and things like that. Another part of the mercantilist policy is that you build luxury industries, manufacturing of luxury items, and in this case, clothing, textiles, gloves, hats, things like that. And they were produced, and the finest of these luxury items in Europe were produced in France, then could be sold for lots of money, and this brought money back into France. And so because of the good financial situation that France was in during this time, Louis XIV was able to spend large amounts of money to make his desires possible. And this includes a very large standing army. It includes a great palace at Versailles, which he's going to use to control the nobility, as well as to fight the wars that he wishes to see through success, because he wants to expand France's borders. So the palace at Versailles, Europe's largest palace, was built during the time of Louis XIV. He himself, when he was a young man, as you again watch the video, but as a young man, he lived through a very traumatic event, which was known as the Fronde, which was an uprising in the Kingdom of France. He had to flee Paris because an angry mob attacked the palace, and he had to move to the countryside. So when he became king, one of the first things he did was leave the traditional homes of the French kings in Paris and moved out into the country, about 20 miles away from the center of Paris, to Versailles, which was a small village where his father had built a hunting lodge. And then around this hunting lodge, a grand palace was built over the next 50 years or so, and it became the centerpiece of the French kingdom. Versailles became a place where all the nobles were expected to live, and while there, they lived under Louis's watchful eye. Louis created a very complex system of etiquette and rules that he himself had to follow, and all the other nobles were expected to follow as well. And so if you were going to be a rich and powerful and important within the French kingdom, you left your land in the provinces, your ancestral homes, and you moved with your family and your staff and your servants to Versailles, and lived in one of the grand apartments there. And while you were there, you visited the king. You watched the king get up in the morning. You watched the king eat. You watched the king walk through the gardens with his family. And then you attended elaborate dances and gatherings in the evening time. And if you were lucky, the king would notice you and give you jobs that you could do to increase your prestige. It was kind of a brilliant play by Louis XIV, because what it meant is that, the nobles, who could be a check and a threat to the power of the crown, what are they doing now? They're spending all their time in Versailles under the eye of the king, not out causing trouble in the provinces and becoming a problem for the king. And everything that they do is trying to impress the king, and by impressing him, you can increase your own status among the other nobles. You fall out of favor with the king, you find yourself ridiculed, you find yourself out of favor, and can be a very difficult situation. You're not going to get privileges, you're not going to get the prestige that comes with having the king's blessing. And so the king made people wear very fashionable and very expensive clothing. Again, it was very expensive to maintain a household in Versailles, which meant that, again, you're not creating your own army at home. You're not, plotting to overthrow the king or take the king's land or whatever. So Versailles became kind of this way that Louis XIV could hold power within France. So, and again, you have a choice, right? You can either subdue the nobles or you can work with them. And Louis is choosing to subdue them by making them live and operate under Versailles. But at the same time, many of them will gain high positions within the government as well. All right. By the time that Louis XIV is at the end of his reign, much of the successes that he had in establishing Versailles and the successes that he had in bringing a very prosperous kingdom in the 1660s and 70s begins to crumble. The last 25 years of his reign is filled with wars. Wars against the Netherlands, trying to expand France's borders in its northwest towards the Rhine River, and then wars against several European powers in what's known as the War of the Spanish Succession, where he is fighting the German states, fighting the Netherlands again, and even fighting England, as all the other European states gang up on France, trying to keep France from expanding their power. And again, we'll talk a little bit about, I think, the War of Spanish Succession a little bit later. Just very briefly, the King of Spain dies without an heir. The closest in line to the Spanish throne is actually the grandson of Louis XIV. And the hope was for Louis is that his grandson would not only become king of Spain, but when Louis himself died, his grandson would also become king of France. So it would create basically an empire of French and Spanish lands in southwestern Europe. And then if you add in the fact that, in the north of North America, you've got the French New France, the French colonies, and then adding in Spain's colonies in Central America, the colony of Mexico, and then Peru, right? That would create a very, very powerful empire for the French, which would certainly allow France to dominate European politics for, many, many decades. And so the other European states went to war to stop this from happening. When the war finally ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Philip was allowed to stay on the throne of Spain, but a rule was created that the kingdoms of Spain and France could never be united. And so it was kind of a Pyrrhic victory for Louis XIV. His grandson could stay on the throne, but his grandson could never be king of France. And so when Louis died in 1715, the great wealth of the kingdom had been dried up. France was in a recession, and there are stories that peasants threw rotten vegetables at the funeral procession of Louis as his coffin was taken on horseback to the monastery of Saint-Denis in the north of Paris, where French kings were traditionally buried. So a king which was seen as the most powerful in Europe, he died very low and unpopular in his own kingdom. Here's some other ways that Louis XIV kind of maintained absolute authority or absolutism in his kingdom. For one, he never conferred with the Estates General. The Estates General is it's a council of the French people, including the nobility. And when the Estates General is used, they act as a traditional check or limit on the authority of the crown. And so by never using them, right, that's a check on the crown that can't be used. He used the tax system of France to bring in a lot of money to fund Versailles. He believed in the divine right of kings. And by doing so, he believed in Catholicism very strongly, and he revoked the Edict of Nantes that, of course, Henry IV had put into place in 1698, and it was revoked in 1598, and then Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which ended religious toleration in France. This forced many tens of thousands of Huguenots to leave the country, going to places like the Netherlands, to England, and even to North America. There was a very large contingent of Huguenots that left France in the 1680s and came to North America, including the American colonies like Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. There was a very large contingent of Huguenots that settled in South Carolina, and many of the important patriots that fought in the Revolutionary War in the 1770s were actually in South Carolina were the descendants of those Huguenots that came from France in the 1680s. Here's some quotes from Louis XIV. We're not going to discuss it, but just kind of shows kind of the backdrop of the, when we think of the power of a king, right? Louis XIV really fits that bill of what we think of a traditional king is, right? It is legal because I wish it. L'état c'est moi, which means I am the state, right? He is the power. And then one king, one law, one faith. That's what he said when he revoked the Edict of Nantes. There was one king, that was him, he was the law, and then he was going to demand one faith. Again, a very powerful king, a great symbol of what it was to be an absolute monarch. But again, mixed success, right? Created this amazing palace at Versailles, was able to create this system of control over the kingdom, using the nobles and their vanity to keep them under control, right? Building a great army, but ultimately not able to expand French power to what he wished it because, number one, wars are very expensive, and he dried up a lot of the money that he raised through a lot of expensive projects. And number two, the other European states joined against each other, or with each other, I should say, against France to maintain what we call the balance of power. Going to be an important thing that we talk about a little later. All right, very quickly, in the German states, we're going to see the rise of two monarchical systems. In Austria, we're going to see the Habsburgs. The Austrian Habsburgs are going to create an imperial monarchy based around Vienna. They're Catholic, and so most of the Catholic lands of Germany will be under Austrian rule. Big thing to understand about Austria is it's a multi-ethnic empire, which means that you have ethnic Germans that live there that speak German. That's what the Habsburgs themselves are. But you also have large minorities. You have Czechs that live in Bohemia. You have the Magyars or Hungarians that live around Budapest. You have people that speak Romanian languages. You have Slavic languages in the south. You have the Moravians, which speak Slovakian. You have Poles that live in the north. So you have all these different ethnicities that are within the Austrian Empire. And because of these many ethnicities, it's just another layer of complexity that the crown is going to have to use. Now, in this particular case, the Habsburgs are going to work with the nobility, right? Rather than subduing the nobles, they'll work with them, because all of the major work of the kingdom is going to be done through the traditional feudal system. The serfs will remain firmly in place. They will not be free the way they are in Western Europe. The serfs will work the land, the nobles will control the serfs, and the nobles will then work as the administrators in the bureaucracy of the state. So the Habsburgs are able to create a powerful monarchy by using traditional methods, keeping the common people in serfdom and cooperating with the nobility. A new German-speaking kingdom that will come into fruition in the early 18th century will be in Prussia, which is in northern Germany, northeastern Germany. In 1701, the Prussian rulers are given the title of king, which raises their stature. Frederick I becomes the first king of Prussia in the year 1701 and will build an important German-speaking Protestant state there. His son, who becomes Frederick William I, or Friedrich Wilhelm, whichever way you feel like saying it, he will become the ruler in 1713, and he will begin to build a powerful monarchy with the power of the military. And so Prussia and the Hohenzollerns are known for their military prowess. And again, we'll come back and kind of talk about this way. But in this case as well, the nobles will become the officers in the military corps. The peasants, the common people of Prussia, will be the soldiers. They'll be conscripted. They'll be forced into service, either on the lands or in the army. And so, again, keeping traditional power, traditional authority in place, the German kings, both in the Habsburg lands and the Hohenzollern lands, will build powerful monarchies. One last one to look at as we are moving eastward, that's going to be Russia. So one thing that you have to remember, that when we talk about European history, it's not just the west of Europe, which we've talked a lot about, but we also have Eastern Europe as well. The traditional kingdoms of Poland, the Habsburg lands of Austria, and then all the way to Russia as well. Russia is kind of a strange state because part of it lies in Europe and part of it lies in Asia. So it took a long time to figure out, were the Russians Asians in their outlook, or were they European in their outlook? One thing is for sure is that when Peter the Great came around in the late 17th century, he firmly fixed his gaze to the west and said that the Russian state will be European in its makeup, in the way it rules itself, in the way that it conducts politics, in the way that it conducts diplomacy. It will be European. And so we can consider Russia a European state from here on out. So the Romanov dynasty of Russia came into power in the early 1600s, Michael Romanov becoming the first Romanov ruler, and the Romanovs would rule Russia as czars, as Caesars or emperors of the Russian Empire until their ultimate fall in 1917 at the hands of the Russian Revolution. Peter the Great, certainly probably one of the greatest of all Romanov monarchs, became king when he was in his late teens, and he was a larger-than-life figure. It's hard to tell from this painting that you see here, but Peter was extremely huge. He was about 7'1", which, of course, would be ridiculously huge now, but in that day and age when most people were very short, right, he towered over people and was just immense in his size and his personality. So it's kind of hard to hide Peter when he went anywhere. But one thing that he became fascinated in as a young man was Western ideas, Western architecture, Western religion. There were several Italian families that had moved to Russia, both as architects and artists and merchants. And that's where Peter liked to hang out as a young man. He liked to go into the European quarter of the city of Moscow and talk with these people and kind of learn about Western culture. And when he was in his late teens, he actually took a tour of several months throughout Europe. He spent time building ships in the Netherlands. He took college classes in England. He visited Germany and different places like that. And so he got the full experience of what it was to be European and European languages, European politics, European sciences. And when he came back to Russia, he brought all of these ideas with him. And he encouraged European people from the West to move to Russia to build universities, to build merchant opportunities, businesses and things like that. And ultimately to build a city, which would be called St. Petersburg. All right, so as it says, his goal as Russian ruler was to westernize and to make Russia more like the West in dress, in manners, in technology, and then to modernize the country, to build a modern army with cavalry, artillery, and foot soldiers using muskets. One of the big things he did, his big accomplishment, just like Louis XIV built Versailles, Peter the Great built St. Petersburg, which was his kingdom, or his capital, named after himself. It was built in the west, so far to the west from Moscow. It's about about 850 miles, I think, from Moscow. It's a long way, because Russia is an immense country. It was located very close to the Baltic Sea, which meant that Russia could, the ships could travel from St. Petersburg through the swampy waters up into the Baltic, where they could then trade with the German states, with Scandinavia, and ultimately with France and England as well. All right. So remember, you can either subdue the nobility or you can work with them. Peter the Great is going to kind of do both. He is going to, number one, he was going to subdue the nobles by forcing them to kind of get with the program. His program is westernization, and so he made the boyars, which is the Russian word for nobles, to be like Europeans. They had to cut their traditional long beards. They had to change their dress. They had to dress like they lived in France, with the fancy silk clothes and the jackets and the knee breeches and all of those types of things. They could not dress in the traditional Russian dress. Hopefully they made some modifications, because of course they're in Russia where it's very cold, but he expected them to be Western in their dress, in their manners, and he made sure that if you didn't do it, you were going to be punished. So you did not cross Peter the Great. He was an autocrat in all ways, which meant that he expected his way to be followed, and he was ruthless if you did not follow his way. There's an example of an uprising of military officers against his changes and his modernizations, and the gang leaders, ringleaders of this, were rounded up and executed in front of their men. And in front of Peter is an example of his authority, that it would not be questioned. He fought a long war with Sweden to gain access to the Baltic Sea, so he could have the window on the west, as we said, and the Treaty of Nystad that he signed with Sweden in 1721 allowed him to get that land so they could build St. Petersburg. One thing I forgot to mention is that earlier, before 1721, he had tried to defeat the Swedes in the Great Northern War and had failed. And so one of the reasons that he went through the modernization of the Russian military was so that it could be powerful enough to defeat Sweden. One thing Russia will always have is a large army, because Russia is so vast. It has huge peasant populations, and they are serfs, just like the other Eastern European countries. And that means that all the nobility have to do is round them up and say, you're going into the military, and they have no choice but to do so. And so they have almost an unlimited supply of men. Once they were trained and equipped with better weapons, they became overpowering of Sweden, won the war, and then got the access to the Baltic Sea that he so much wanted. And then finally, he forced the nobles not only to shave their beards, but he forced them to serve the state. He built universities and training centers to train the nobles. The nobles would become the military officers. The nobles would become the tax collectors. The nobles would become the officials and the judges and all of the other administrators that he needed to run the kingdom. And state service was your duty. You had no choice as a noble but to serve the state. So he's kind of subduing them by putting them in positions of power, which is kind of doing both. So the traditional nobles become partners with the autocratic Romanov dynasty, maintaining authority over the rest of the population, and therefore keeping the crown in firm control of the state. And that includes, of course, the church as well. There's no separation of church and state in Russia. The autocrat, the ruler, the czar, is ruler of heaven and earth in many ways, because he is also the head of the church. There's a great picture of Peter shaving the boyars. You see on the left, those are the traditional boyars with their beards, their traditional clothes, shaving their beards, and they're going to be dressing like they are on the right, with the mustaches, with the shorter haircuts and the knee breeches. So a great example of kind of this shift and this change in Russia. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off the video here. This will be part one of this review of the unit. When we come back, we're going to talk about the alternatives to absolutism, ultimately spending the most time looking at the 17th century in England, the English Civil War, and ultimately the constitutional monarchy that is established in England, which is the alternate to absolutism that we see in France and these Eastern European states. We're going to see a limited monarchy where power is held by other forces, in England specifically in Parliament. But we'll come back and we'll do that later. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon.